My parents looked me straight in the face and said, "You don't make financial contributions like your sister does. This is her home now." I stared at them for a moment, genuinely expecting one of them to crack a smile and reveal that this was some cruel joke, because after everything I had done for them, the sentence was almost too absurd to process. Instead, my father folded his arms while my mother avoided my eyes. I finally nodded and said, "Thanks for the clarity. My name is Evelyn Harper. The original events never specify my exact age, but by then I had spent enough years cleaning up my family's financial disasters to recognize what was happening. They had mistaken reliability for obligation. They had gotten so comfortable with me saving them that they no longer considered what I gave them a contribution. It was simply something Evelyn did. And now they were handing the house to my younger sister Melissa because she had promised them something bigger. The house was supposed to be mine. Not eventually, not theoretically, not after another year of negotiations. Daniel Brooks, my boyfriend, and I were supposed to close that week. My children had already spent part of the summer there, and my youngest son had chosen his bedroom. We had discussed schools, furniture, moving dates, even which wall Daniel wanted to repaint first. Then one afternoon I opened social media and saw Melissa standing on that familiar front porch holding a bottle of champagne. Her husband Greg stood beside her, grinning while holding up a set of keys like he had just won a prize. The caption was something smug about new beginnings. I stared at the picture until the screen went dark in my hand. That porch was supposed to become mine. I had already sent bank statements, signed preliminary documents, arranged the transfer schedule, and paid the lawyer's retainer. Melissa had done none of that. She had simply told our parents she might be able to give them more money than I had offered, and apparently the word might was worth more than everything I had already put on paper. I called Mom immediately. Voicemail. I called Dad. Nothing. I texted them both and asked what was happening. No reply. For 2 days they ignored me, as if silence could turn betrayal into a misunderstanding. On the 3rd day, Dad finally answered. He sounded tired, but not ashamed. "Things changed, Evelyn." That was his explanation. Melissa had offered more. They didn't want to make things complicated, so they had made what he called a quick decision. I almost laughed. "Quick? We've been discussing this sale for months." Melissa barely had stable employment. Greg had just been laid off again. My sister had defaulted on loans before and treated repayment deadlines like optional suggestions. Dad dismissed everything with the same sentence, "She'll figure it out." So I reminded him who had actually been figuring things out for years. I covered their mortgage during the worst period of their finances. I helped pay for the roof. I handled groceries when their bank balance was almost empty, hospital bills they couldn't cover, car repairs, Christmas gifts, emergency expenses. Every time their life developed a leak, I had been the person standing underneath it with a bucket. "It isn't about money," Dad finally said. "Melissa needs this more. We're her parents too." Something inside me became strangely quiet. Normally, that sentence would have started a 2-hour argument. I would have listed every sacrifice until they acknowledged I had a point. I would have demanded an apology, received half of one, then eventually returned because keeping the family together had always somehow become my responsibility. But this time I simply listened. And the longer he talked, the clearer everything became. Melissa failed. They protected her. Melissa lied. They found an excuse. I succeeded. They depended on me. I sacrificed. They forgot. They didn't fear losing me because history had taught them I would always return. They assumed I would be hurt, complain for a few weeks, and then start paying for things again. I wasn't furious anymore. I was done. Daniel tried to pull me away from the anger that evening. "We'll find another house," he told me. "Probably a better one." He wasn't dismissing what happened. He knew the problem was bigger than the building. But my children were still staying with my parents for their summer visit, which suddenly made everything feel different. The arrangement had been made before the house situation exploded. They were supposed to spend a few weeks swimming, helping Grandpa with the garden, and enjoying time with their grandparents. I called Mom the next morning and said, Daniel and I would pick them up early. She ignored the call, then texted that ending the visit now would be too disruptive. According to her, the children were already settled and didn't need additional confusion. I read the message twice because I couldn't believe she was talking about my children like they were guests whose reservation I wasn't authorized to cancel. Dad eventually answered. "We don't think bringing them home right now is a good idea," he said. "You're emotional. The kids need a calm environment." I gripped my phone tighter. "They're my children." He sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Nobody said they aren't." "Then Daniel and I are coming tomorrow," he immediately objected. That was when I told him plainly that if they refused to return my children, I would arrive with law enforcement. His voice changed instantly. Suddenly I was overreacting. Suddenly I was embarrassing everyone. Suddenly we needed to behave like adults. Funny how people obsessed with family harmony always discover the concept of peace immediately after someone stops obeying them. The next afternoon, Daniel drove with me to the house. We parked across the street and called the sheriff's office before approaching. An officer arrived roughly 20 minutes later. I watched him walk toward the house while my stomach twisted. Dad came to the door. There was some back and forth. He gestured toward our car more than once, probably trying to explain why I was supposedly unstable or vindictive. The officer remained calm. Eventually, the front door opened, and my children came outside carrying their bags. There was no goodbye hug from Grandma, no kiss, no attempt to reassure them. Dad stood behind the screen door with his arms crossed and watched them leave. My daughter climbed into the back seat, clutching her backpack tightly against her chest. My son waited until we had driven several blocks before quietly asking, "Mom, are we in trouble?" That question hurt more than losing the house ever could. "No, sweetheart," I told him. "You didn't do anything wrong." Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand. Nobody spoke for several minutes. My parents had turned a disagreement between adults into something that required a sheriff to retrieve two frightened children. I thought that would embarrass them enough to stop. Instead, 1 week later, an envelope arrived from a law firm. My father's name was attached to it. They were threatening to sue me. According to the letter, my parents had supposedly provided me with years of ongoing financial support and now wanted reimbursement. I sat at our kitchen table reading the document twice, before laughing, because the claim was so detached from reality that anger almost seemed pointless. Any money they had ever given me had either been repaid or was microscopic compared with what I had spent supporting them. I forwarded everything to my lawyer. Less than an hour later, he called. "This is garbage," he said. "If they want to humiliate themselves in court, I'll happily let them." He sent their attorney a formal denial and requested documentation supporting every alleged debt. We never heard another word from that lawyer. What finally broke whatever sympathy I still had wasn't the legal threat. It was what they started saying to my children. My daughter came to me one evening and asked, "Mom, why does Grandma say you don't care about family?" I froze. She explained that Grandma had told her I removed them early because I was spiteful. My son asked if I was going to stay angry at Grandpa forever. That was when I understood they weren't simply defending themselves to friends or relatives. They were deliberately rewriting the story inside my children's heads. I saved every message, every email, every document, and went to the police to make a formal report about the earlier custodial interference. The officer warned me there probably wouldn't be serious consequences because the children had eventually been returned, but I didn't care. I wanted a record. I wanted one official line somewhere proving that boundaries had been crossed. Daniel and I began discussing something we had previously considered impossible, leaving the state entirely. We wanted enough distance that there would be no accidental grocery store encounters, no unexpected visits, no grandparents appearing at school, no constant pressure through mutual acquaintances. 3 months later, we did it. New house, new jobs, new schools, new routines. My kids adjusted faster than I expected. Daniel seemed lighter. So did I. There were no Christmas calls. No forced birthday conversations, no emergency requests for money. For the first time in years, Silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. Sometimes I would wake up on Saturday mornings and realize nobody needed me to solve something. No roof repair, no overdue payment, no Melissa crisis. I assumed my parents would eventually recognize the price of their decision. Maybe Melissa would somehow make the house work. Maybe she and Greg would stabilize themselves. Maybe my parents would convince themselves they had been right all along. None of that mattered anymore. I had finally stopped organizing my life around the consequences of other people's choices. Then, one quiet Sunday morning, my phone rang from an unknown number. I ignored it. A few minutes later, it rang again. Daniel glanced over from the kitchen and asked who kept calling. "No idea," I said. The phone rang a third time, and something made me answer. "Evelyn?" Melissa whispered. Her voice sounded shaky enough that I sat upright immediately. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then I heard her breathing unevenly through the phone. The house burned. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. "What do you mean, burned?" Melissa was crying hard enough that some of her words blurred together. "There had been an electrical fire," she said. "Something about an overloaded outlet near the laundry room. She and Greg had been out when it started." By the time they came back, smoke was pouring from the back of the house, and firefighters were already there. The rear rooms were blackened, part of the roof had collapsed, and the place was basically unlivable. I asked the only question that mattered first. "Was anyone hurt?" She said no. Then came the sentence I had been expecting from the moment I recognized her voice. "We need somewhere to stay." Apparently, the insurance company had already warned them that most of the damage might not be covered because the policy had never been properly updated after the ownership transfer. Somehow, after being handed a house practically overnight, Melissa and Greg had failed to complete one of the most basic responsibilities that came with owning it. She kept talking, explaining that they could stay with us temporarily, that it would only be for a few weeks, that they would pay rent if we wanted. I looked across the room at Daniel. He could hear enough from my expression to understand exactly what was happening. "Melissa," I said quietly, "we're not in a position to take you in." The crying stopped for half a second. Then her voice hardened. "Seriously? After everything?" That almost made me laugh. After everything. She had somehow managed to take the phrase I had every right to use and point it back at me. I told her I was glad she and Greg were safe. But my answer was no. She called me cruel. I ended the call before she could turn it into another negotiation. A few hours later, Mom called. She didn't ask how the kids were. She didn't ask about our new house or how Daniel was doing. She immediately started telling me how disappointed she was. "Melissa is your sister. Family is supposed to help each other." I asked why she and Dad weren't taking Melissa and Greg in themselves. There was a pause. Then Mom said their place wasn't equipped for 2 extra adults, that Melissa and Greg had too many belongings, that it would be disruptive. I nearly admired the consistency. "So giving them a house based on a promise wasn't disruptive, but letting them sleep in your spare room is?" She snapped that I was being vindictive. I told her I was simply respecting the choice they had made. She hung up. Over the next several days, the pressure became constant. Dad called. Greg called. Melissa called again. They all repeated different versions of the same argument. I had space. I had money. I was stable. Therefore, it was my responsibility to absorb their disaster. They spoke as if the house had fallen out of the sky instead of being handed to Melissa after being taken away from me. I stopped answering. Then a mutual friend from our old town contacted me and filled in the rest. The insurance payout was going to be much smaller than Melissa expected. Worse, she and Greg had already missed payments. The bank had started sending notices. Foreclosure was now a real possibility. That should have been between Melissa and the bank. Instead, my parents turned it into a public campaign against me. I heard they were telling relatives that I had refused to save the family home. They conveniently skipped the part where it was no longer my home, because they had given it away behind my back. They skipped the sheriff, the legal threat, and the comments to my children. Dad left me a voicemail one night, close to 11. His speech sounded slightly slurred. I can't believe what you've become, Evelyn. Family means stepping up when things are hard. You've become heartless. I listened once, saved it with the rest of the evidence, and went back to bed. Then came the group email. Mom, Dad, Melissa, Greg, and several extended relatives had been copied into some enormous speech about forgiveness, sacrifice, and how families weather storms together. One cousin I barely knew replied that holding grudges only hurts everyone. Another wrote something about being the bigger person. I stared at the email chain for several minutes before typing one sentence. I wasn't family when you gave her the house, so don't call me that now. I hit reply all. Nobody responded after that. Meanwhile, the foreclosure moved faster than anyone expected. Melissa had apparently ignored enough notices that the bank already had a sale date in motion. Someone from my old neighborhood told me she and Greg were packing whatever they could salvage and storing boxes at my parents' place. The truly unbelievable part was that Mom and Dad still refused to let them stay there permanently. Greg spent a weekend with a former coworker before being asked to leave. Melissa ended up at a cheap weekly motel on the edge of town. Apparently their solution was to keep searching for someone else to carry the consequences. When they realized I had stopped responding, they went after Daniel. Mom called him at work, pretending she was checking on us. Then she slipped into the real purpose of the call, telling him Melissa was frightened, sick from stress, and sleeping somewhere unsafe. Daniel has always been compassionate, and my mother knew it. Years earlier, that approach probably would have worked. He would have asked whether we could help, just for a few days. But he had been beside me when we retrieved my children with a sheriff standing nearby. He had seen the legal letter. He had watched my daughter ask whether I cared about family. He listened until Mom finished and said, "Please don't call me about this again." Then he blocked her. A former neighbor sent me screenshots from the community Facebook group several days later. Mom had started implying that I was somehow responsible for Melissa losing the house. The story changed depending on who she was talking to. Sometimes I had supposedly backed out of a promise to help with repairs. Other times I had taken financial support away at the worst possible moment. In one version, I had practically forced Melissa out. I expected to feel furious. Instead, I laughed. They were standing inside the wreckage of their own decisions, and still looking around for someone else to blame. Daniel looked at the screenshots and asked whether I wanted to respond publicly. No, I said. People who believe that story were never going to ask me what happened anyway. I thought the foreclosure would finally exhaust them. I was wrong. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived at our new house with the logo of Child Protective Services on the envelope. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. The complaint alleged that Daniel and I were emotionally neglecting our children, isolating them from extended family, depriving them of important relationships, and creating an unstable and hostile home environment. The wording was careful. Whoever wrote it knew enough true details to dress the lies in something believable. We had moved away. We had cut contact with grandparents. The children had experienced conflict. Each fact had simply been twisted until protecting them sounded like abuse. Daniel read the letter and went pale. I knew immediately who had done it. Maybe Melissa. Maybe Mom. Maybe all of them together. It almost didn't matter. This was no longer gossip. They had tried to bring the state into my home because guilt and legal threats had failed. I spent the next 3 days building a file. Text messages. Emails. The lawyer's letter. Screenshots of Mom's public posts. The police report from the day we retrieved the children. Voicemails. Dates. Every ugly thing I had once wanted to forget became evidence. The caseworker arrived the following week. She was professional and calm, which helped, but seeing a stranger walk into our home to decide whether we were good parents made me feel physically sick. She spoke privately with both kids. She asked about school, food, discipline, friends, Daniel, me, and whether they felt safe. My son came out afterward, looking nervous, and asked if he had answered correctly. I knelt beside him and said, "There were no correct answers. You just told the truth." Later, the caseworker sat with Daniel and me at the kitchen table, reviewed the documentation, and told us she saw nothing that suggested neglect or danger. The case still had to be formally documented, but she expected it to close quickly. It did close, but that didn't undo what happened. My daughter wanted to know why someone thought we were bad parents. My son asked if someone could come take him away. That was the moment any remaining part of me that hoped my family might eventually apologize disappeared. They had already tried money, guilt, lawyers, rumors, and my children. Now they had weaponized a government agency because they couldn't tolerate being told no. Then, a few days later, an old friend from town sent me another message. Melissa had moved back in with our parents, and she was pregnant. Melissa being pregnant didn't change how I felt about her, but it changed everything about the way my parents presented the situation. Almost overnight, the same two people who had complained that Melissa and Greg were too disruptive to live with suddenly acted as if having them under their roof was a blessing. The 30-day limits disappeared. The complaints about space vanished. Mom started posting ultrasound pictures and writing captions about miracles, second chances, and how family always finds its way back together. An old high school friend sent me a screenshot of one post where Mom had tagged my name beneath Melissa's ultrasound photo. Even though some people have turned their backs on us, this baby reminds us what love really looks like. I stared at it for maybe 10 seconds and then closed the message. Daniel asked whether I wanted him to report the post or tell my mother to leave us alone. No, I said. She wants a reaction. I'm not giving her one. What bothered me wasn't the insult anymore. It was how easily they rewrote history. In their version, Melissa hadn't been given a house she couldn't afford. My parents hadn't refused to return my children. Nobody had threatened me with a lawsuit. Nobody had filed a false CPS complaint. Somehow they had transformed themselves into wounded parents whose heartless daughter abandoned them during a crisis. Then Dad called me for the first time in months. I let it go to voicemail. His voice sounded different, quieter, almost rehearsed. He said they wanted to make things right. Apparently, everyone had said things they didn't mean. Apparently, the new baby was a sign that we should start fresh. He even offered to pay for Daniel, the kids, and me to come visit. Your mother would love to see you, he said. We've started putting together the nursery. You should see it. The nursery. He said it as though a freshly painted room could erase everything they had done. I didn't delete the voicemail. I saved it with the others. Daniel noticed and asked why. Because I want to know what happens when I don't answer, I told him. I had learned something important about my family. Whenever affection failed, pressure came next. 2 weeks later, Mom sent an envelope with no return address. I recognized her handwriting before I opened it. Inside were several pages of floral stationery covered in careful cursive. The beginning was exactly what I expected: memories of childhood, family dinners, holidays, the baby, forgiveness, how short life was. Then the tone shifted. She wrote that she and Dad had spoken with another attorney and were considering revisiting unresolved financial matters between us. She claimed there might still be a legal case involving money they had supposedly invested in me over the years. Somehow, she described that threat as a path toward reconciliation. I handed the letter to Daniel. He read half of it before looking up at me. They're threatening you while asking you to come home. Exactly. I added it to the file. Love first, threat second. Same cycle, different stationery. That same week, I learned the foreclosure was complete. The bank had taken the house. Melissa and Greg had lost whatever remained after the fire and were forced out again. They bounced between friends, relatives, and anyone too uncomfortable to say no immediately. My parents still insisted they couldn't house them permanently, even with a baby on the way. Then, the rumors changed again. According to 2 family acquaintances who contacted me, I had supposedly offered Melissa a room and backed out at the last minute. Another person had been told I promised to help with repairs, but withdrew the money because I was angry about the original sale. None of it had happened. One woman messaged me asking why I couldn't be the bigger person for the baby. I almost typed out the entire history, but I stopped. I had spent years explaining myself to people determined to misunderstand me. I wasn't doing it anymore. One evening after the kids were asleep, Daniel and I sat on the back porch, talking about everything that had happened since we moved. He asked a question that surprised me. Would you ever move again? My first instinct was no. We had only just rebuilt our lives. But then I understood what he meant. Our parents and old acquaintances still knew enough about where we lived to keep finding ways into our lives. Letters arrived. Calls came from unfamiliar numbers. People acted as messengers. Maybe, I said. But I don't want to move because we're running. Daniel nodded. Then we don't run. We choose somewhere new. That distinction mattered to me. A few months later, we moved across the country to a smaller town where nobody knew Melissa's name, nobody knew my parents, and nobody cared about a burned house 3 states away. We didn't leave a forwarding address with relatives. I didn't announce the move online. We simply disappeared from their map. Life became almost boring, and I loved it. The kids made friends quickly. Daniel settled into his new job. We had a backyard with actual grass and neighbors who waved without asking personal questions. Occasionally, an unknown number would call. Sometimes, Mom left messages about Melissa's pregnancy. Once Melissa herself called and said we should put everything behind us for the sake of her daughter. I deleted the voicemail before she reached the end. I didn't know exactly where they were living by then, and I stopped asking. For the first time, their crises could happen without automatically becoming mine. I honestly thought the story was finished. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, a certified envelope arrived at our door. Inside was a baby shower invitation for Melissa. The location made me laugh before I even realized I was doing it. My parents' house, the same house they had repeatedly described as too cramped, too chaotic, and too unsuitable to accommodate Melissa and Greg long-term, was apparently spacious enough to host an entire baby shower. The invitation was printed on glossy cardstock with pastel flowers and a link to an expensive registry. Daniel read it, gave me one tired look, tore it in half, and dropped it into the trash. Neither of us needed to discuss whether we were going. A few days after the shower date, my phone started ringing from an unknown number. Once. Then again, several hours later. The calls continued for nearly 2 days before I finally let one go to voicemail. It was Dad. He sounded older than I remembered. There had been an accident during the baby shower. Maybe a candle, maybe something near the oven. Nobody seemed completely sure. Decorations had caught fire in the dining room. And by the time people realized how quickly the flames were spreading, the fire had reached the kitchen. 2 bedrooms were destroyed. Smoke and water damage ruined much of what remained. Nobody had been seriously hurt. Melissa and the baby were safe. Then, Dad became quiet for several seconds. "Your mother and I don't have anywhere to go," he said. "We're staying in a motel, but we can't keep paying for it." I called him back because for once I wanted to hear him say the request directly. He told me Melissa and Greg were staying with one of Greg's cousins, but they couldn't accommodate Mom and Dad too. Then came the line I knew was coming. "You've got the space, Evelyn." I almost admired the audacity. They had taken a house I was preparing to buy and handed it to Melissa. That house burned. They had tried to keep my children from me. They threatened me legally. They attacked my reputation. Someone from their circle filed a CPS complaint against my family. Now their own house had burned, and somehow the final solution was still supposed to be me. "Dad," I said quietly, "you've had 2 houses burned down around this family. But the fires aren't really the reason you have nowhere to go." He started telling me this wasn't the time for old arguments. "You're right," I said. "Those arguments ended a long time ago." Then I hung up. The next morning, Melissa texted me a photograph of herself holding her baby. No explanation. No request. Just the picture, as though a newborn's face might open a door that manipulation had already slammed shut. I looked at it for a moment. The baby was innocent in all of this, and I genuinely hoped she had a better childhood than Melissa, and I had managed to give each other as adults. But loving an innocent child from a distance didn't require letting dangerous people back into my life. I deleted the message and blocked the number. 2 weeks later, an old neighbor called me. What remained of my parents' property had been condemned. The bank had taken control, and demolition was being scheduled so the land could eventually be cleared and sold. Melissa and Greg had also declared bankruptcy, but that wasn't why the neighbor called. Apparently, my parents were telling people that I had promised to buy the property back. They said I was going to repair everything, restore the family home, and make things right. For several seconds, I genuinely couldn't speak. Even after 2 fires, foreclosure, bankruptcy, police involvement, lawyers, and CPS, they were still inventing an imaginary version of me who would eventually return with a checkbook. That was when I finally understood something that gave me more peace than any apology could have. They didn't miss me. They missed the woman they thought they could control, the daughter who paid bills without asking questions, rescued everyone from consequences, tolerated disrespect, and returned whenever someone said the word family loudly enough. That woman no longer existed. They built their future on Melissa's promises, then tried to rebuild it on lies about me. When everything collapsed, they expected me to be standing in the smoke with another solution. I wasn't. I was hundreds of miles away, sitting beside Daniel while my children slept safely down the hall, in a home nobody in my family could give away, threaten, or use against me. My parents could keep telling everyone that their imaginary daughter was coming back to save them. Maybe believing that story made reality easier to tolerate. But the real Evelyn Harper had already left, and this time, I wasn't coming back.